Chapter 11, How Far Can Media Systems Travel? This is the beginning of the end of the book and the first half of our semester. And here we're done with our case studies until we jump into our next text. Here we're thinking about it qualitatively. What are the implications of all the findings of all these chapters and different case studies about trying to take a Western media model outside of the Western world? And the authors bring up a really great point. Almost every country outside of the Western world that we've looked at fits into the polarized pluralist model. What is the chance that 180 or so countries in the world are all going to fit into one model? What's more, let's think about our 18 or 17 cases that the models are based on. We brought this up at the end of last chapter. Now here we want to talk about it more. 18 countries. What kind of countries are these? These are, number one, Western. Number two, democracies, but liberal democracies, the freest of the freest countries in the world. They're advanced economies. They are some of the richest countries in the world. Are these countries the norm? Are they characteristic of the 200 or so countries that exist in the world? No, not at all. So the author rightfully points out, why would you try to expand media models from a minority of the countries of the world to the rest of it? That concept, that idea in and of itself, bleeds Western bias. And then from here, the author is going to go into further why the four variables specifically do not work. Now we look at media structure as a variable and newspaper circulation. We've all had an issue with this for quite some time. Let's dig into it. One major issue that this chapter draws out is the fact that this does not take in level of development as an issue. Why would that be important? The author points out that so many countries in the world are developing countries. You could argue about 120 of them, which would mean the majority of the world are developing countries. So what does that mean for newspapers? It means a lot of these countries, first off, have started developing and gained independence in the mid-1900s. So it means radio was already a thing, television was already a thing. Very quickly, those two mediums, TV and radio, expanded across the globe. And many of these developing countries completely skipped over newspaper printing as a medium for the distribution of news. Because it was inefficient, because these countries were developing, their infrastructure was lacking, they didn't have distribution routes for newspapers. So he says if that's the majority of the cases in the world, then this variable should not even be considered to be used. Find a different way to measure newspaper consumption, or news consumption rates rather. And in state intervention, what's wrong with this variable? Well, specifically, when you're looking outside of the Western world, you're starting to realize that most countries are hybrid countries, or hybrid meaning half democracy, half authoritarian, leaning one way or the other, or they're authoritarian. They say a more interesting way and a more useful way you could separate state intervention is excessive regulation versus excessive interference. So let's take North Korea, for instance. North Korea regulates and owns and operates its entire media system, whereas China allows privatization, marketization, commercialization, but it still interferes and causes journalists to self-censor. Those are two important differences, okay? And the models and state intervention as it is right now offers no way to show the differences between authoritarian media systems. This is a huge problem. Now, political parallelism. What's the problem with this variable? So much. But let's narrow in on what the author is talking about. Political parallelism is the extent to which political parties influence or own or operate media organizations in a country. The variable completely ignores what those political parties are based on. In Western democratic countries that the models are made for, Most of those parties are based off of labor or capital concerns or post-materialistic concerns, meaning labor rights, workers' rights, minimum wages, regulations of financial markets and credit card companies for existence, interest rates, what they should be, tax credits, tax cuts, saving the environment, how much you are able to pollute into a water from a factory, how much screening and filtering does your car have to have. That's the concerns of a lot of political parties in these Western countries, these 17, 18 countries. What are the political parties for most countries in the world? Many of them are based on race, ethnicity, where you're from, geography, based on religion. Most political parties around the world are identity politics. They're based off of who we are as a people, not necessarily our ideology of what we believe for post-materialistic concerns. So what's the difference on political parties that are based on identity politics? Well, identity politics, generally speaking, there are a lot of things that are connected with culture. Culture is belief. Belief is hard to change. When people believe something hard, it's difficult for them to cooperate and collaborate, and as we say here, reach across the aisle for bipartisanship. Because your beliefs, you don't want to sacrifice your beliefs. That's what they are. We also see much research around the world talking about conflict being based on identity politics. And media systems, we really haven't talked about yet what media systems are like in war zones or in conflict zones, and how identity politics can be related to that. So this is a complete different dynamic of political parallelism that you don't get from the models. All right, and what about journalistic professionalism? Well, we've been implying it. Let's outright and say it. This is completely a biased way of measuring journalistic professionalism by democratic standards. Democratic, watchdog, fourth estate journalistic professionalism standards has only existed arguably since the 1960s or the 1970s, with things like news coverage of the Vietnam War and things like Watergate and investigative journalism. Before that era, before 50 or 60 years ago, media as the fourth estate, that notion did not exist in the world. So to measure journalistic professionalism by democratic standards that have only existed for half a century, in comparison to when the rest of the world is using the norm that has been used for all of human existence, we can go outright and say it. That's Western democratic arrogance, to think that the right way to be professional is by democratic standards. Who are we to say that a communist journalist cannot be professional, or a partisan journalist cannot be professional, or a citizen journalist who has no education from a university in journalism, who's to say they cannot be professional? The idea with journalistic professionalism and the problem with using it as a variable in these models is that it's a subjective term. And in political science, we try to be objective. So the author suggests, wipe your hands clean of this one and just throw it away. Let's figure out something new. So let's wrap it up. Put a nice little bow on this chapter. The author argues, why try to categorize media systems around the world by 3 models that are based on 18 countries that are outliers rather than the norm? That's a great question. In political science, we would not do that. We would not try to categorize things or make generalizations based off of an outlier case, outlier data. Now, why would you try to do that? In our conclusion chapter next week, we're going to talk about why it is still useful. But here we're talking about the flaw in trying to do so. But regardless of that, which it is a flawed approach, the author does bring up some commonalities that we are seeing around the world. Things like the media market is becoming globalized. They're saying that transnational media is becoming more and more of a thing. All right, so that also insinuates we need to perhaps move away from this state-centric model-making process. The number of media conglomerates is decreasing. That means in the world, let's say there are 20 major media companies. Over time, the trend has been going 19, 18, 17, 16. What happens to the world when fewer and fewer media conglomerates control more and more of the media around the world in a transnational system? Something we need to think about. The limited number of conglomerates are controlling more of the worldwide media, and predicts media is converging in the future. But converging towards what? So if there are fewer companies owning everything, and the media market's becoming more globalized, the author is predicting, yes, that's going towards something. Now, in this chapter, the author is predicting perhaps it is going towards the liberal model. Now, this is interesting for a few reasons. One, it could be the fact that over time we have seen democracy as a regime type, and even in hybrid regimes and elections, we've seen them increase more and more. It could be that the author simply believes that this trend in democratization will increase moving forward. However, we're going to talk about next week. Has the trend been towards democratization lately? The past 14 years? We will get there. But the point being, if all four of these things are true, and democracy is starting to be the dominant regime type over the past century, then one would theoretically think that the major media conglomeracies are going to be from the richest countries in the world, mostly democratic countries, save China. And since those corporations are from democratic countries, theoretically, their business model would be based on the liberal model. What do you think? I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this one. At me in the forums. I'll talk to you soon.